The morning air at Fort Ashcombe was cold and still, the kind of quiet that made every sound carry twice as far. 32 Rangers stood in loose formation near the firing line, stamping their boots against the chill, waiting for the new instructor everyone had been talking about since the day before. Her name was Elena Voss. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with short brown hair tucked under a plain field cap. She did not look like the instructors these men were used to. She did not carry herself like someone trying to prove anything either, which some of them found strange, and others found suspicious. "They sent us a woman to teach long-range marksmanship," one ranger whispered to the man beside him. "Command must be joking." The whisper spread. By the time Elena walked out to the edge of the range, carrying her rifle case in one hand and a small notebook in the other, most of the men had already made up their minds about her. She heard the murmurs. She always did. 11 years in the service had trained her ears to catch things she was never meant to hear. She set her case down gently on the wooden table at the edge of the line and turned to face them. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm, even, carrying just enough to reach the back row without needing to shout. "My name is Captain Elena Voss. I'll be running your advanced marksmanship qualification for the next 2 weeks." A few rangers nodded politely. Most did not react at all. One man near the front, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Coyle, folded his arms and looked her over slowly, the way a man might examine a used truck he already suspected was overpriced. "With respect, Captain," Coyle said, "we were told this course would be led by someone from the long-range program. Someone with field time." "I have field time," Elena said simply. "Combat time," Coyle pressed. "Confirmed distance work. Not classroom stuff." A ripple of laughter moved through the group. Quiet, but unmistakable. Elena let it pass without flinching. She had learned long ago that arguing with doubt rarely changed anyone's mind. Only proof did that. "I understand your concern," she said. "By the end of today, you can decide for yourselves whether I belong here." She turned back to her rifle case and began unpacking it, laying out each piece with the practiced calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The rangers watched, some curious, most still amused, a few already whispering bets among themselves about how quickly this instructor would embarrass herself. What none of them knew was that Elena Voss had grown up on a small farm 2 hours outside of nowhere, where her father, a retired Marine, had taught her to shoot before she was tall enough to see over the kitchen counter without a stool. She had spent her childhood weekends lying flat in wheat fields, learning to read wind through the way it bent the stalks, learning patience the way most children learn multiplication tables. By the time she enlisted at 19, she could already outshoot most of the men in her basic training unit, though she rarely mentioned it. She preferred to let her targets speak for her. Her career since then had taken her through assignments most of these rangers would never see on paper. 3 deployments, 2 engagements at distances that had, at the time, set records within her unit. She did not talk about those missions. Some of them, she was not permitted to talk about at all. None of that mattered to the men in front of her now. To them, she was simply new, and unproven, and female, and that combination seemed to be enough. The morning session began with basic review, breathing control, trigger discipline, reading Mirage off hot barrels. The rangers went through the motions without much enthusiasm, several of them exchanging glances whenever Elena corrected their form. A young private named Dez, clearly newer than the rest, seemed the only one paying real attention, watching her explanations with quiet interest instead of skepticism. By midday, the mood on the range had settled into a kind of polite tolerance. The men followed her instructions because they had to, not because they believed in them. Coyle in particular seemed determined to test her at every turn, asking pointed questions about calibration and ballistic drop, as though hoping to catch her in a mistake. She answered each one directly, without hesitation, without ever raising her voice. It was during the afternoon session that everything changed. The Rangers had just finished a sequence of shots at 800 meters, a distance most of them could handle competently, when Coyle spoke up again, louder this time, clearly meant for the whole group to hear. "Captain, with all this talk about long-range theory, when do we actually see you shoot?" The question landed exactly the way he intended. Several Rangers straightened, suddenly interested. Someone in the back laughed outright. Elena turned to face the group. and for a long moment, she said nothing at all. "You want a demonstration," she said finally. It was not a question. "We want to know if you can back up what you're teaching," Coyle said. "No offense, Captain, but book knowledge and real shooting are two different things." Elena studied him for a moment, then looked past him toward the far end of the range, toward the distant line of hills where the terrain rolled out toward the extreme end of the facility's rated distance. Fort Ashcomb's range had been built decades earlier, with unusually long sightlines, designed for exactly this kind of extended qualification. Few instructors ever used the full length of it. Fewer still dared to. "Range officer," she called out, "what is the maximum rated distance for this facility?" The range officer, a quiet man named Sergeant Halbrook, who had said little all day, checked his clipboard. 3,600 meters, Captain, though nobody's used the FAR marker in years. "Set a target at 3,500, Elena said. The words landed like a dropped stone in still water. 32 Rangers went silent almost at once. Even Coyle's smug expression faltered, just slightly, as though he had not expected his challenge to be taken quite this seriously. 3,500 meters was not a casual distance. At that range, a bullet would travel for several seconds before reaching its target, long enough for the rotation of the Earth itself to nudge its path sideways. Wind would not simply push it once, but shift and change across dozens of different pockets of moving air along the way. Humidity, temperature, even the slight curve of the bullet's own spin would all conspire to pull it off course. Confirmed hits at that distance were rare enough to make headlines within the sniper community. Most of the Rangers present had never even attempted a shot past 2,000 meters, let alone witnessed one at nearly double that length. "Captain," Halbrook said carefully, that's an extreme distance. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Elena said. Word spread fast. Within minutes, off-duty soldiers from other parts of the base had gathered near the range fence, drawn by whispers of what was about to happen. Coyle stood near the front of the group, arms still crossed, though his earlier confidence had thinned into something closer to nervous curiosity. Young Dez had pushed his way to a spot near the firing line, eyes wide, clearly hoping to see something he would remember for the rest of his career. Elena knelt behind her rifle and began her preparations. She did not rush. Around her, the wind had picked up slightly, and she watched the small flags positioned at intervals down the range, each one bending at a slightly different angle as the air moved unevenly across the open field. She studied the heat shimmer rising faintly off the ground near the halfway point, an indicator of temperature and air density that would affect the bullet's flight. She checked her scope's elevation turret, running calculations in her head that accounted for the curvature of the Earth itself, adjustments so precise that a single missed decimal could send the shot meters off target. Her spotter, a quiet corporal named Reyes, who had been assigned to assist her that morning, called out wind readings from 3 different points along the range. Elena listened, adjusted, listened again. The crowd behind her had grown larger, but the range itself had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that seemed to press against the ears. Somewhere far in the distance, the target sat small and pale against the hillside, barely visible without magnification, a mark that from this distance looked less like a target and more like a rumor. "Captain," Reyes said quietly, "wind's steady. You're clear." Elena settled deeper into position, her cheek resting against the stock, her breathing slowing into the practiced rhythm she had built over more than a decade of training. She thought, briefly, of her father, of wheat fields bending gold in summer wind, of a girl small enough to need a stool who had once dreamed of nothing more than hitting a paint can nailed to a fence post 200 yards away. She thought of how far that girl had come and how little that distance had ever mattered to the people who judged her before she opened her mouth. She exhaled halfway, held it. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the way it always did in these final seconds. The noise of the crowd fading into something distant and unimportant. Her finger found the trigger. She fired. The crack of the shot rolled out across the valley, sharp and sudden, followed almost immediately by a strange kind of silence, the collective held breath of 32 Rangers and dozens of onlookers who had never witnessed a shot travel this far. At 3,500 meters, the bullet would spend nearly 5 full seconds in flight, an agonizing stretch of time in which nothing could be changed, nothing corrected, the outcome already decided, the instant the trigger had been pulled. 5 seconds is a strange length of time to wait for anything. It is long enough to doubt, long enough to hope, long enough for 32 men who had laughed at a woman that morning to suddenly, quietly, begin to wonder if they had been wrong. Through his spotting scope, Reyes watched the distant target with unblinking focus. The seconds stretched. And then, without warning, the target shuddered and dropped, struck dead center, with a precision that left no question about intent or chance. "Hit," Reyes said, his voice unsteady with disbelief. "Direct hit, center mass." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Halbrook, still staring through his own binoculars, as though needing to confirm it twice, lowered them slowly, and looked toward Elena, with an expression somewhere between astonishment and something close to reverence. "Confirmed," he said. "Center hit, 3,500 meters." The silence broke all at once. Somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a low whistle. Murmurs turned to open exclamations, disbelief shifting rapidly into something like awe. Dez, still standing near the front, turned to look at Elena with wide eyes, his earlier curiosity now replaced with unmistakable admiration. Coyle said nothing at all. He simply stood there, arms no longer crossed, staring down the length of the range toward a target he could not even see without magnification, struck by a shot fired by the woman he had dismissed only hours earlier. Elena rose slowly from her position, brushing the dust from her uniform with the same calm, unhurried manner she had carried all day. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply turned to face the group, 32 Rangers who now looked at her with entirely different eyes than they had that morning. "Any more questions?" she asked, "about whether I belong here?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Coyle was the first to step forward. He extended his hand, something in his posture entirely different now, stripped of the smugness that had defined him hours earlier. "Captain," he said, "I owe you an apology. I've never seen anything like that." Elena shook his hand without hesitation. "Apology accepted, Sergeant. Now let's get back to work. You've all got a lot to learn, and we're not finished yet." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the group again, but it was different this time. Warm instead of mocking, respectful instead of dismissive. Even Coyle managed a small, genuine smile. Over the following 2 weeks, the Rangers who trained under Elena Voss stopped questioning her methods and started absorbing every word she offered. She taught them patience, precision, the discipline of waiting for the perfect moment, rather than rushing toward an imperfect one. She taught them that skill was not something that announced itself loudly, but something that revealed itself quietly, in the moments when it mattered most. By the end of the course, several of the men who had laughed the loudest on that first morning had become her most attentive students. Dez, in particular, spent every free hour he had asking questions, eager to learn everything she was willing to teach. Years later, long after he had earned his own reputation as one of the finest marksmen in his unit, he would still tell the story of the day a woman everyone doubted put a bullet through a target from 3,500 meters away, and changed the way an entire company of Rangers thought about judging people before giving them a chance. Elena never spoke of that day as though it were extraordinary. To her, it was simply proof, the kind she had offered many times before and would likely offer again. That skill did not care about assumptions, and that respect, when it was real, always had to be earned the hard way. The wind still moved across the hills of Fort Ashcombe long after that afternoon had passed into memory, bending the grass the same way it always had, indifferent to the doubts of the men who once stood there, and to the quiet, steady woman who had proven every one of them wrong.